very much for the invitation to. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I have a bit of a tough act to follow for two reasons. The first reason is that I agree with everything that Maria was saying. There's basically two things. A, we know a lot. We critical geographers or expert analysts on social, political, economic, and environmental affairs. Most people here in the audience that I know have contributed massively to a now very well established history and current practice of radical, critical, geographical thought. And we can now also include the question of nature, ecology, and the climate into that dynamics and criticism of what goes fucking around in the world. On the other hand, Maria shows us with a few examples, but we all know how much energy that is out there of all sorts of people who in a variety of ways try to fight and produce a different world. Extraordinary. We rarely seen worldwide, in Greece, in Europe, the rest of the world, so many people trying to work in a variety of ways for something different, something that is ecologically more sensible, socially more just, and politically more inclusive. Now, the perspective I'm going to give is a Manichaean one. We have failed massively. We have failed massively, and I am interested in why it is that we fail. That is, we do know, and we do act, and the critical knowledge in the cathedrals of knowing is hegemonic. In the UK, my kind of Marxist, post-colonial, feminist, deconstructionist, postmodern, more than human perspectives is dominant. We won. But it turned out to be a Pyrrhic victory. At the same time that we were doing our critical theorizations and our political action, the world shifted dramatically to exactly the opposite that we want. And you know what? We're very good at analyzing that too. I can do that blindfoldedly. Our enemies have taken over exactly at the time that we thought we were constructing the knowledge and the strategies.
Okay.
Sorry. So I think we have to think again what it is that we think and say. And I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer, but I'm going to try to talk around this paradox. And climate is the best illustration of this much wider situation. Well, basically, the argument goes as follows. We know the truth of climate change. Very few of us doubt it. We know the science and we know the disastrous consequences it has. And people in Greece living in the summer every year is getting worse. We know. Scientists know. Activists know. Many politicians know. And the situation gets worse every day. There seems to be an extraordinary gap between knowing and acting. And that's what I want to talk about. It reminded me of a fantastic quote, 1974, by a German intellectual now long dead, who wrote one of the first fantastic pieces on political ecology in the New Left, in the New Left Review. It was called The Critique of Political Ecology. And he said something that we have ignored for too long. He said the imminent catastrophe, 1974, the imminent catastrophe, right? Yeah. Well, it has been a catastrophe for lots of people, not for me. For me, actually, in 74 today was a great success. I would not be standing here if it was not a great success. But lots of people died. What a catastrophe. The imminent catastrophe is conjured up with a mixture of trembling and pleasure, and awaited with both terror and longing. As an old Marxist, I loved capitalist crisis. It vindicated the truth of my analysis. I reveled in the pleasures of having been right. Of course, knowing that the suffering out there was massive, but at least I was right, and I could viscerally feel the pleasure of being right, but being completely impotent. So I think this kind of strange pleasure, which I call enjoyment, is what my talk is about. And, but it should be possible.
It's there. What?
Yeah, just leave it here. So the title of my talk is, the first slide is just the title, is Enjoying Climate Change. Oops. Jouissance as a political factor. And that's precisely the cut I would like to make, is that to grapple with this paradox of the difference between knowing and acting. And I think it revolves around enjoyment. Jouissance as a political factor. Leave it. So I want to start from the disavowed truth of climate change. The fact that the climate condition is thoroughly depoliticized, I would argue, and is hegemonically structured through arguments and practices of potential techno-managerial solution, nurtured by both some activists say we need a sustainable city, as well as, of course, by the eco-modernizers who use the climate change as a gigantic business opportunity. So there's a gap, I would argue, between knowing and acting, very well summarized by a Russian intellectual in 2020, who said, and I think we critical theorists have to take that really seriously. Critical knowledge does not self-evidently translate into transformative action. That was our assumption, was it not? That our theories mattered. It turned out to be a lie. Critical knowledge does not self-evidently translate into transformative action, as such action is trumped by libidinal investment in sustaining the fundamental configuration of the present capitalist socio-ecological order. It's precisely that this libidinal attachment, enjoyment, that I want to focus on. I would argue that a psychoanalytic perspective, which is precisely centered around doing those things that we don't know. That's precisely what psychoanalysis does, or tries to explain, that we do things without knowing that we do them. And it was, of course, Sigmund Freud who formulated that first. And of course, historically, there have been quite a lot of Marxist psychoanalysts around. My perspective draws very much on Lacanian psychoanalysis. Lacan, who was extremely faithful to the Freudian edifice, but at the same time radically transformed it. For Lacan, the subconscious was not just a kind of physiological thing, a biologically constituted thing, as Freud still argued further. Lacan, the subconscious is deeply culturally, symbolically, and linguistically constituted. And of course, as we know, psychoanalysis has primarily been used in the clinic. I'm not interested in that. I'm not a clinicist. But I am interested in how the understanding of subconscious drives, desires, our deepest enjoyment, structures our politics. So following Jody Dean, I'm interested in considering enjoyment as a political factor. A Lacanian, by the way, I'll say something more about that later. Enjoyment is the English translation of the French word jouissance. It's extremely difficult to translate. So enjoyment has very little to do with the pleasure or with satisfaction. That's what Freud was interested in, the pleasure, the principle. He argued that people were seeking pleasure and satisfaction. Enjoyment is much more like Mick Jagger. I can get no satisfaction. So enjoyment is a deep, often painful, excessive, and anxious pleasure that we keep on repeating. Think of your own secret enjoyment and you will know what I'm talking about. A Lacanian Marxist perspective on the climate deadlock, and I'll say something about the climate deadlock, what I mean by that in a moment, tries to think through the differences between capitalist dynamics that we know are the root cause of environmental issues. Who disagrees with that? Precisely. Nonetheless, we keep on living our life ideologically as a fantasy. So what I will pay a lot of attention to is what the Kenyan psychoanalyst called fetishistic disavowal. We know, but nonetheless, I act as if I do not know. And I think we are as much, we intellectuals, radical intellectuals, are as much implicated in that as anyone else, but in very different ways. I'll come back to that later. So we also want to insist from considering a change from knowledge as a political factor. Remember Foucault, knowledge is power? To enjoyment or jouissance as a political factor, which I think it has been massively ignored at our cost. Of course, enjoyment is always structured through fantasy, right? The fantasy, for example, of climate activists is we want a good world, socially inclusive, environmentally sensible. What do we need to do in order to get there? Bring greenhouse gases down. That's a fantasy we do know. Who believes that bringing down greenhouse gases will produce a socially inclusive, more democratic world? No one does. Which does not mean we should not bring greenhouse gases down. It's the connection that is a fantasy that is sustained by all sorts of people. So what I'm interested in is the mind, is to mind the gap between knowledge and action. So I'm going to make 4 points. That is to say a bit about the climate deadlock situation that we're in now, which is disastrous. It's disastrous. And how can that be? Since we all know that it's happening and why it's happening and how it's happening and what is causing it. The situation is getting worse every day. I will then say something more about what I mean by enjoyment as a political factor. And I will then illustrate that by focusing on 2 types through which climate is enjoyed. On the one hand, the super-ego injunction to enjoy. The super-ego is the kind of thing that suddenly says, yes, you can. You know, really, you shouldn't, but nonetheless, you do it. Yes, I can. That can be positive. Think of Obama. Yes, we can. Also be the most perverse. Yes, I can. And another form of enjoyment is the imaginary enjoyment, usually found with climate, not all, but with many climate activists, which circulates around things like sacrifice, denunciation, and theft. Someone is fucking it up for us, but it's not me. Someone else is doing it. And of course, the classic psychoanalytic cure is to traverse the fantasy through which we repeat the painful enjoyment that sustains our pain, our unhappiness. That also, I would argue, needs to be done with respect to the climate fantasy that sustains forms of enjoyment and which does exactly the opposite of what we say we want to achieve. In fact, I'm going to argue the apocalypse is disappointing. The apocalypse is not going to happen. The catastrophe is not going to happen. It has already happened. It is too late, not for us here. Think of the 25,000 people that we do know are lying on the bottom of the Mediterranean. Here we have a great example of human, non-human interaction. Each time when I'm in Greece, I eat fish from the Mediterranean. I think, what the fuck am I eating? I'm eating a human, non-human assemblage produced by the catastrophe of people dying for political and social ecological reasons. That's what I'm interested in. Yeah, the catastrophe is already there for many people, but not for others. And it's precisely that structure that continues the catastrophe and deepens it for some and not for others. Okay, the climate paradox. What I mean by that is that today there's a widely shared consensus about the climate, and it's a strange consensus. It took 30 years to forge it. Activists, scientists, critical scholars, politicians, civil society organizations, local, national, and international levels forged an extraordinary coalition. Rarely seen. The COP meetings are an evidence of that, of a wide consensus. Those who argue it's not happening are relegated to the margins of respectability. There's a consensus about climate change as a real and imminent danger, a knowledge that is articulated around the imaginary of a future catastrophe that's going to happen unless we act now. So despite now 30 years of mobilization of all manner of social, technical, and institutional dispositives, including quite radical forms of activism, the extinction, the value neutralizers, etc., the real, in Lacanian terms, the reality of the climate is deteriorating on a daily basis. In 1990, there was the moment that the climate began to be talked about. In 2018, there was a 65% increase of greenhouse gas emissions. The concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, that is where climate activists say it should be below 300 ppm. That's a magical figure that they take out of a book or out of a head somewhere. No, 300 ppm will have a happy, sustainable world. Yeah, above that, it's a nightmare, right? Now, I'm fine with that idea. But the concentration in the atmosphere in 2020 was 413 ppm. This is off the charts. We have no history of that on Earth. And it keeps on going. I checked last month, February.
Now it's working.
It was 426, and it goes every day. You can actually see it online. Oops! Oh, back.
Some time.
Patience.
During the worst COVID year of 2021, remember lockdown? Remember we were all locked up, the economy down? Greenhouse gases increased by the second highest on the record. And in 2023, it increased by 1.1%. Now that is odd. That's a deadlock situation, an impasse. We know, widely shared, we act in ways that actually makes the situation worse. As Kevin Anderson, climate scientist, not one of those woolly social scientists like myself, climate scientist, at Manchester University said we have lived in 3 decades of abject failure, a litany of technical fraud as managed climate policy. He's a climate scientist. So there seems to be a cognitive dissonance between what we know and how we act. Here's another example here in Europe. The European Union is priding itself on bringing greenhouse gases down. I read the newspaper almost every week. We're winning. It's true that in the European Union, greenhouse gas emissions are going down, and the Green New Deal will further improve that. Now, I was walking around earlier with Prestige in Plaka, and you look around, 80% of the stuff you can buy there is from China, right? 70% of the consumption basket of us Europeans or Americans comes from China. So what are we doing? What is Europe doing? Is exporting its greenhouse gas emissions to elsewhere and then importing it as consumer goods. Nicely illustrated by China and India, where greenhouse gas emissions. That is important to do with the rising living standards in China and India, but also by the structuring of the uneven pollution that organizes our daily life. Okay. So there seems to be something going desperately wrong. I would argue that the core of the deadlock can basically be translated as follows. We know very well the truth of the situation, but nonetheless, we act as if we do not know. That expression was first formulated by is this the next one? By Ottavio Manoni, who called it fetishistic disavowal. That is, when you say one thing and you do something else, it's fetishistic disavowal. For Jacques Lacan, cognitive dissonance, this gap between knowing and acting, it results from fetishistic disavowal of the unsymbolizable real of the situation. The real of the situation is the capitalist technical and class configuration that produces the climate change. Facing the real of that situation is experienced as traumatic. It's too big to handle. It's too painful to stare in the face. It would mean that we have to get rid of capitalism, which means we would have to have communism or socialism or something of that kind. Too painful. When I talk to younger activists, they say, oh, we want to have a socially more inclusive world, a common organization of non-human stuff in a democratic way. So that's what I call communism. I say, oh, no, not me. So this fetishistic disavowal operates in the form of a displacement of the discursively, linguistically symbolized design for real socio-ecological change. That is the critical fantasy. We want a different world. Who does not want a different world? Ha! That is the thing, in Lacanian terms, the thing with a capital letter T. Of a stable climate, a socially inclusive world, onto something else in the imaginary that stands in for the bigger and apparently unachievable desire. This empty space between the real thing was too big, too terrifying, too dramatic. Do you want to give up on your private property? Is filled out, in turn, is displayed by what Jacques Lacan calls the object cost of design. What gets our juices going? What causes us to get up in the morning? He calls this the objet petit a. Right? It's not the big social transformation we can achieve. We're going to deal with greenhouse gases, and that will get us to this better world that we had imagined. So environmental activists say. You see here the strict parallel on a cultural and political level and sexual fetishism. What is a sexual fetishist? But for him or her, the real body of the full woman or man is too dramatic. It's too difficult, too painful to encounter, so it's displaced onto an aspect of it. Underwear, a foot, glasses, smell. Fetish So desire, which is formulated as a desire for socio-ecological change, becomes in fact articulated around CO2, in the case of climate, and other greenhouse gases, that is fantasized as the little thing, which then of course opens up the perspective that we can, through managerial, institutional, and technical adjustments, achieve that better world. Just as a matter of dealing with green. Well, we all know, of course, that greenhouse gases are just a symptom of the ecological situation, of the climate situation. It's a symptom, not a cause. So CO2 and other greenhouse gases, but I can apply this to other examples too, operates as the fetish object. The phantasmic desire for a different society becomes framed around handling CO2 as the privileged object to redirect the history of the future. It hides, by doing so, it hides, of course, that subjects do not really desire a different world. But they want to hang on to what they have. The minimal attachment to the givens. We can have our cake and eat it. There's very much a parallel architecture. I don't have time to talk about that here. I've written about this between the dominant climate discourse, including that articulated by activists, and our worst enemies, xenophobic, populist racists. What do xenophobic, populist racists say? Greek society is internally nice, fine, and coherent if it was not for these fucking foreigners. If we can get rid of these fucking foreigners, Greece would be fine. Or the European Union during the crisis. If it was not for the crisis, Greece would be fine. The Germans are the same, the Belgians and the Dutch and the Brits. Isn't the argument, the discourse of climate, not exactly the same? If you could just get rid of excessive CO2, the world would be happy. We would live happily thereafter. So, to extend now Manoni's definition of fetishistic disavowal, despite the fact we know very well the facts of climate change and the need for an ecologically sensible and socially just society, we nonetheless act as if we do not know, by displacing it onto greenhouse gases, sustainable urbanity, electrical vehicles. Elon Musk is going to say. In order to get at that fetishistic disavowal, we have to take seriously the question of enjoyment as a political factor. What I'm going to make next is that climate and its change is not only a threat to the world, which it is. It is also something that is enjoyed in one way or the other. And that needs to be understood. So what is repressed, disavowed, or foreclosed is the criminal attachment to the present status quo, including the pleasures of critiquing it while painfully enjoying it. Yeah, I painfully enjoy being a critical activist, academic, intellectual. It's also this kind of practice of both eco-modernizers and eco-activists. And that is what my talk is aimed at. It's at those who are fighting for a better climate in this world. They get very upset with me sometimes. But I do think we need to consider what it is we say and what we do in light of the drama that is unfolding out there. Enjoyment as a political factor. In the history and practice of both your political theory and political action, two main modes of argumentation of what the political is, coincided, developed parallel, and sometimes intertwined. Politics has been and is, I don't disagree with that, is a struggle for power. Machiavelli, Nietzsche, Marx, Foucault, and many, many others. Politics is a power struggle. It's about who wins and who loses. It's about getting power in. Or it's about considering, discussing, arguing, and fighting over what constitutes the public good and the public bad. These have been exclusively the two ways to which politics has been theorized and acted around. These are the discursive dominant frames for environmental politics today too. All my students do the critical environmental analysis. It's all about things that are environmentally fucked up because of power, capital, blah, 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 etc. And of course, the environment is about the public good. We have to save the public good. 99% of critical studies are around these two. So I would argue together with others, Dean McGowan, Zizek Verhagen, and a growing number of people, of the centrality of also, together with these others, to consider enjoyment as a political factor. So what is enjoyment? Here is Jody Deal speaking. Enjoyment refers to an excessive pleasure and pain, to that extra something that twists pleasure into a fascinating, unbearable intensity. Each time the Athenian anarchists of Eschalgia go and do mayhem, they enjoy it. This is enjoyment at its best. Hopefully they will be beaten up by the police and put in jail overnight. That will be the summum of their enjoyment, to name just one example. It's a special kind of agony. It's an agony that makes us feel more alive, more fully present, more in tune with what makes life worth living and dying for than anything else. It's our mojo, as the Americans would say. It's what gets us going in the morning. It's why we get up in the morning. Most of us don't get up to do a stupid teaching job or marking exams, which I'm doing now. Jesus Christ, you know, I thought I'd commit suicide and continue marking exams. That's not why I get up in the morning. Enjoyment then is this extra, this excess, beyond the given, beyond the measurable, the rational, and the useful. It is that something extra for the sake of which we do what might otherwise seem irrational, counterproductive, or even illegal. So we argue that the knowledge about the climate becomes infused by a set of particular fantasies and discourses that circulate around the specific object cost of design. I'm summarizing now what I've just said. It obscures what shapes the climate situation, and in doing so, keep the environmental case circulating around the fetishized thing. To assure, of course, that nothing really changes. Most of the techno-managerial interventions that are taken to deal with the climate, but of course to make sure that the world as we know it can continue for a while longer. This fantasy is what structures enjoyment, and that becomes expressed in the social bond, in the social relationships that become constituted around the climate. I'll come back to this. So I'm going to differentiate between two dominant strands. They're not the only ones, not the whole night. I'm going to look at two types of enjoyment that structure the relationships to the question for the climate. First, a passionate engagement in destroying nature. That is what those people that we think are stupid. They're not. They know exactly what they do. A passionate engagement in destroying nature based on an imperative to enjoy fossil fuels and what they metonymically stand for. And second, the second type of enjoyment, what they were considered is others. So, not that the enemies, people don't like, but us. There's an equally passionate commitment to saving nature, quote unquote, based on imaginary enjoyment that stems from renunciation, sacrifice, and the illusion of theft. The first, the superego injunction to enjoy climate change. I'm sure the older generation among you will recognize and remember Sarah Palin, who was the running mate for the vice presidential candidate during the 2008 McCain campaign for president. And she, at the time, controversially said, "Drill, baby, drill." Of course, referring to the need as governor of Alaska to continue oil-based exploitation. It's of course difficult to ignore the libidinal attachment inscribed in the slogan, uttered by a woman, "Drill, baby, drill." Not just the overly sexualized meaning and erotic excess of the slogan strikes. In fact, Penthouse Corporation made a soft-porn flick with the same title a year later with a Palin lookalike as the porn actress, playing the movie Drill, Baby, Drill. Palin, of course, expressed with this slogan a deeper satisfaction with the continuing destruction of the planet, as well as with transgressing. She knows she is transgressing the dominant consensus about the challenges and dangers posed by climate change. This is jouissance at its best. Fuck you, and I'm enjoying it, despite the fact that I know what I'm doing. It's excessive, painful, often self-destructive, yet exhilarating and non-transgressing. Of course, today, this has been generalized by the former and in all likelihood the next president of the United States. He cloned Dick's Cole, and he took up in his campaign this year. Google it. Drill, baby, drill. This time from a masculine champion. It's actually interesting that it crosses gender boundaries. Both women and men of a particular kind say, "Drill, baby, drill." So here is we are going to drill, baby, drill. Another example, some may remember the actions of drug riders and others in Canada on the border between the US and Canada, occupying the bridges over the border for a while to demand the oil pipe, the construction of the oil pipe, which has been highly contested, the XL pipeline controversy, etc. Here are Canadian workers over the border say, "We want this pipe, we love oil." And of course, this superego injunction to enjoy can also be done for activist purposes. These are images of a leisurely practice done by American activists of a particular kind. These are people who change their engines of their big SUVs and cars such that a pump house is thick, dense, black smoke. And as a form of entertainment, they go and drive around cyclists or go and circle around activists who are fighting for environmental, the nice boys and girls, right? So rolling coal is an intentional act of air pollution. It's illegal. It's against the US, the Clean Air Act, needless to say. Rolling coal is an intentional act of air pollution for the sake of entertainment or protest. One could say that we're getting, when we see images of Americans wrapping hybrid cars, cyclists, and protesters in dirty clouds of smoke, is precisely a direct insight into into American values, into the very core that obscene enjoyment that sustains US life. It's strictly parallel to the images of Abu Ghraib that we've seen, where they electrocuted an Arab prisoner in the jail. Pictures that say exactly the same. Jordi Dean puts it, Super Ego says, go ahead, do your duty, break the law. The Greeks are very good at that too. This is precisely what learning calls on. Okay. I would also argue that eco-modernizers, that is the kinds of Elon Musk, of those who make a profit on nurturing eco-sensitive technologies, etc., of course, take deep pleasure in the continuing destruction of the earth because their profitability is precisely predicated upon making sure that the environmental conditions further deteriorate. So, from a Freudian perspective, then sustainable business is unconscious fantasy of earthly annihilation, as expressed by continuing to supporting the destruction of the planet while acting as if it is the opposite, presents an almost archetypical analytical case of the expression of the dead life. The dead life is a synonym to enjoyment. Okay, now us. The imaginary enjoyment of environmental action of climate change. So from Al Gore to Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion, many climate activists and movements proffer the enjoyment of sacrifice as a way out of our environment. Akin to the sacrificial pleasure that promises ultimate enjoyment in some future wholesome Arcadia, sacrificial practices seemingly pave the way to a wholesome, socially just, and ecologically more sensible world. So, renounce excessive consumption, promote flight chain, reducing automobile use, etc., and the anxiety-ridden, if not depression-inducing loop of always insufficient asceticism. It's never good enough, our renunciation. Indicates a libidinal attachment to sacrifice as a road to fullness. A deep, excessive, and disturbing enjoyment lurks underneath the consciously symbolized concern with the earth and earthlings, but such that nothing really has to change. Here is a classic example. I'm not singling out Greta personally, but there's a stand-in of a wider mode of engaging with. So for many, the problem, the loss of enjoyment, has been stolen by someone else, whose very enjoyment stands at the fulcrum of what is presumably lost. How dare you? Our house is burning. You have stolen my future. Well, precisely suggest that there is someone else who is enjoying in your place. And what we need to do is to return to a place of unstolen enjoyment. So here too, enjoyment is associated with unfulfillable, satisfying, and with a deep pleasure propelled by transgressing hegemonic ways of speaking nothing. That's why she's invited. The world here prior to climate change, or even nature more generally, is posited as something that once upon a time was good. If you could just go back there, it was great. That, of course, Arcadian ideal of a past to go back to never existed to begin with. It's a pure fantasy. So that's why I would argue much of climate activism is what the Kenyan psychoanalysts call impotent acting out. It's hysterical acting. So there would not be anything wrong with what environmental activists do if it were to be harmless. It's dangerous. As McGowan puts it, imaginary enjoyment allows the subject to remain securely rooted in its symbolic identity. It respects symbolic barriers, even as it offers the subject the illusion of transgressing them. It does not threaten the stability of the symbolic order. It keeps us saying it's climate change that is the issue, which of course is not. I put these slides on this afternoon because have you noticed that Greta, who is not any longer a willing teenage girl who has embraced a good cause, she's now a mature woman, right? Have you noticed she has disappeared from public media? When was the last time you read about her in the newspaper, saw her on TV, etc.? Now, this is an image from the fall of last year. Amsterdam march, 50,000 people marching against the climate change, and Greta was invited as one of the keynote speakers on the podium. In her speech, she said, no climate justice on occupied land. Needless to say what she's referring to. Right? Environmental activists jumped on the podium to stop her speaking. This is at the moment that she was making the dangerous connection between geopolitics, the genocide in Palestine, and climate change. And of course, on that podium, she did this. We all know what the political significance is. This is a different Greta. This is not any longer one that is impotently acting out. That's why she's not in the media any longer. Almost there. Okay, quickly finishing now. I've tried to account for how enjoyment matters and how enjoyment is structured by different people in different ways. I'm particularly concerned with the impotent enjoyment that structured the life and work of activists, my siblings. And I also try to argue that the particular enjoyment that they nurture is structured by fantasy. So what needs to be done is to cut through the fantasy that sustains the consensual argument about the imminent danger of climate change. There are a few, I'm only going to single out two, that we urgently need to think about rather than we collectively repeating the same fantasy. All of my colleagues in radical Manchester in environmental sciences repeat the same fantasy. First, the insistent construction, just I believe, of a dystopian, quasi-catastrophic future. Right? And secondly, since that is a catastrophic future, why should that not happen? To save humanity and the non-human world. Yeah, we have to stave off the catastrophe in the future in order to save humanity. So the apocalyptic imagine is that it's not too late yet. It's 5 to 12. It has been 5 to 12 for 30 years now. It keeps on being 5 to 12. It nurtures fear as the central leitmotif. Fear is, of course, also the central ideological construct of neoliberal culture. It disavows and displaces the political conflict by invoking a universal humanitarian threat, which is a lie. We geographers know that it's a lie, that it does not fit with empirical reality, and that can be avoided by techno-managerial adjustments. It's not too late now. Or by opting out, as those say, it's too late. They opt out, they go with what they want. And this is about because the blind and uneven apocalypse that characterizes socio-ecological conditions. First of all, the revelatory diplomacy of apocalyptic narrative has to be fully rejected. It's precisely the image of future disaster that sustains the possibility of that particular imaginary that is dominant. Our answer should be, the catastrophe will not happen. It has happened. It is already too late. We are already living in the social ecological ruins of ecological transformation. That is, we have already past the point of no return. There is no going back. But in fact, the apocalypse, although it's the reality, it's not ours. It is that of the refugees in Athens. And those that Maria was talking about, or that Thunberg was talking about, who are digging up the lithium and the copper so that our solar panels can function here. Our survival, actually, our socio-ecological sustainability. I live in Amsterdam. It's one of the most sustainable cities in the world. I love it. It's beautiful, fantastic. It is bought at a genocide of coltan mining, lithium mining, water extraction, not in Amsterdam, of course. I can't go into a shop in Amsterdam, a coffee shop, a real coffee shop, without having to eat avocado and quinoa by the assembled vegetarian wokes. But we do know that these superfoods produce a social ecological catastrophe in Peru, in Chile, and in Mexico. So if you were to start from the premise that a social ecological catastrophe has already happened, the kind of technical, managerial, and institutional answers we would begin to formulate suddenly begin to sound very, very different to those nurtured by climate activists and their allies. The second fantasy is that humanity has to be saved. Yeah? The earth has to be saved from overheating so that humanity has a chance for survival. As Blanchot, French communist intellectual in the 1960s already stated, humanity does not exist. Humanity has never existed, except for some pockets here and there, like the kind of social activism you sometimes see on most scales, from Athens to the global world. Humans exercise the most brutal violence onto other humans, as indeed Gaza, Ukraine illustrates, but also many, many other things like my mobile phone. Each time I buy a new mobile phone, I put a Kalashnikov in the hand of a black kid around the Great Lakes in Africa. What humanity? In fact, it is precisely the absence of humanity. Now I'm making a classic Marxist argument. It's precisely the absence of humanity that produces the ecological catastrophe to begin with. It is the brutal exploitation of some by others that produces the drive for accumulation's sake, the ransacking of the world's natures, locally and globally. It's precisely the absence of humanity that is the very cause, and we know that, don't we, of the social ecological condition that we're in. So politically, the only hope we have is the old one, barbarism or communism, right? Either we produce a humanity in the way in which Seminarea was talking about it, or we let the barbarism continue, which will surely lead to the earth burning up. But it will be after my death, and be my children, given their socio-ecological position, will just turn up the air conditioning. Thank you very much.
So we have some time for questions, not a lot, because we have to leave the room at some point. But Erik is here to answer the question.
If I may say, most enjoyable.
Thank you. I take that as an enjoyable compliment. And that's why I'm coming.
One thing that comes to mind is reading Bertrand Russell's autobiographical essays in which he writes that he was totally convinced that England went into World War I out of sheer boredom.
Ah, yeah,
He saw no
yes.
reason, there was no logic to it.
Yes. So since our mind is structured by enjoyment, and I want this to be taken seriously, around what do we want to construct our enjoyment? You know, what is it that we do the impossible for? And let me just compare and contrast that with the 20th century, and I'm just giving it an example, not to go back there. How many men and women gave their life for this object cost of desire called communism? It's a bit of a failure. Exactly. Compare and contrast that by giving your life to CO2. So enjoyment can be structured around very different objectivity. What is it that is your mojo? And how does it change? You know, this is part of the book. We also try to say, why is it when I talk to my younger students, who are all very good girls and boys who care about society and the environment, and they are vegetarians, recycle, don't fly, and I applaud them. That's very nice, of course. It's the perfect neoliberal subject who thinks and believes that this individual action will actually amount to something. We all know it amounts to less than nothing. Less than nothing. It only covers up the kind of sense that they're doing something, knowing full well. That's why so many kids are depressed, simply because they know it's stupid what they do, but they can't think of anything else. They can't even imagine the possibility of active action that politically fights for the transformation of socio-ecological order. So that the CO2 configuration becomes different. CO2 is a symptom. Greenhouse gas is a symptom, right? It's like taking an aspirin when you have the flu. Same thing. So.
Greece could have more communists, but they are still depressed.
Yeah, at least in Greece I can use that word. Although often when I look at how the official party does it, I think, have they not woken up from the 20th century? So my idea of communism is, of course, communism adapted to the 21st century, right? We all know that 20th century communism was a bit of a disaster, and I'm sure you've also noticed the strict parallel between Stalin and Putin, right? But we do not accuse Putin of being a communist asshole. He's just a capitalist asshole. There's a strict parallel here. So we have to define. Have you not noticed the absence of political signifiers, just like dwells in language, right? We are against racism, against xenophobia, against the climate change, against capitalism, against financial speculation, against the architecture of the European Union. What the fuck are we for? What is the political name for the desire? And when I bring that up, because they ask me, what's your name? I can only think of two, socialism and communism or something of that ilk. And I'm like, oh, not with me. Not with me. What does that suggest? Not with me. A libidinal attachment to the painful existence of the existing configuration. It's a libidinal attachment. But by the fear to embrace the uncertainty, which it would be, is, of course, you say, I want communism, well, I don't know what I'm going to look like either, right? It's a risk and a fear. But you have to make a judgment that that risk and failure is more enjoyable than the disaster that we know capitalism is. And we certainly not fool ourselves by, oh, it has to do with technology. We just can get the technology right, or become vegetarians. Yeah? Or do wild camping.
Ali ερώτηση, anything more?
A lot of things. I'm coming from a different background from everyone. I'm coming from design,
Okay.
systems thinking also a bit.
Yeah.
But this is unrelated. I'm thinking, what can be maybe, if you think that enjoyment is necessary in the human condition, or if
It's unavoidable. Yeah.
because I was thinking a bit about the pain and all that stuff, like more the Zen kind of way of thinking, the middle.
Yeah. Yes.
And maybe I was thinking like of
Yes.
indigenous ways of doing
Yes.
things.
Yes. Yes.
More
Yeah.
symbiotically. What do you have to say about
Oh.
Try to be short.
Yes,
because we
yes,
don't have much time
yes.
for the room.
Yes. Obviously, indigenous cultures and societies have a very different cosmology, and their enjoyment is structured in very different ways, and that matters and has to be cherished. What I find perverse is a politics, sort of post-colonial politics that I'm surrounded with in the UK all the time, whereby the mobilization of endogenous cosmologies of a certain kind is mobilized as a strategy for our future. That does not work. That does not work. Moreover, what is largely forgotten when all of my students love endogenous, they love them, and oppress knowledges and practices that are ecologically much more sustainable, etc. What is completely forgotten are the silent voices of the indigenous communities. Some have been murdered, yes. Most in Latin America and Africa moved to the big cities. In Africa, in Asia, or Latin America, it's only been a particular kind of indigenous communities. Most changed their life, transformed them. That's why second, it's also again a way of displacing or disavowing the internal contradictions of the combined and uneven socio-ecological dynamic. It sounds nice to say, let's do Zen. How the hell is that going to stop financial speculation of the kind that Maria was talking about? Yeah. That requires a particular kind of commitment, a particular kind of violence. So the Zen thing is just an escape from facing the real of the situation. That's why so many hapless managers love to go to Tibet, to do a Zen yoga, precisely because that helps them to cover up the very inconsistencies. And also, anyway.
One more question because we have to leave the room.
Okay. Question is that if we push for the argument that apocalypse already happened, doesn't this create a death threat, which anyway sounds right? Doesn't it create a death threat, or is it sounds of its own time in a kind of since it's already happened?
Of course. Of course, my argument is not about abolishing enjoyment for that. On the contrary, is to make it much more central stage and acknowledge what is at stake here. Now, when we say the apocalypse has already happened, it is now impossible to get to a depoliticized techno-managerial set of solutions, because they are all initiated in order to avoid the apocalypse. Now, if the apocalypse has already happened and combined and uneven, how do we save lives? By changing, for example, our refugee configuration. That will save lives, socio-ecologically speaking. That will immediately involve a massive political struggle. I'm sorry.
If it fits with that, right? On kind of get vertical now instead of wait for it.
I'm not saying, no, I'm not saying let's burn it now. In fact, I'm saying it's just burning for some people. Not for me. Not for me. And I'm certainly not arguing that it should burn for everyone. I am just arguing by recognizing that the world is burning for some and doing something is much more in line with what our type says we want, which is a more just, ecologically sensible, and democratic society. That's what we say we want. I am arguing that the structure of enjoyment and unconscious functioning of that maintains this gap that we say we want a different world, but yet keep on do the everyday things, including buying electrical vehicles or becoming a bit more vegetarian or flying a bit less, etc. Or you're recycling. We all do that. Okay, good. Okay.
Okay, thank you.